Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra and I am a Tolkien scholar, which means that I study the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, and actually I feel like I should clear that up. It doesn't necessarily mean expert. A lot of people will call me an expert. I don't try. The reason that I chose scholar is because I'm more about learning than lording over people with knowledge. I want to share knowledge with you, surely, and I love when people ask me questions about Tolkien's works, but I just wanted to kind of address that because there are a lot of people who, like, they fashion themselves as experts, and that there's really nothing wrong with that if that's what they feel. But I got a very lovely comment just the other day asking me, like, about how do you become a Tolkien scholar? And I want to answer that here. I answered the comment, but I want to answer it here. There's no rule about it. There's no law. There's no, like, council that tells you when you're a Tolkien scholar. People started calling me that, and I like it because a scholar is not necessarily somebody that teaches, although they can, but somebody that learns. And I'm always learning new things about Tolkien. Every single day I'm learning something new about him. So anyway, we're going to get to your questions. If you have questions for me, you can leave them in a comment, but if you want them to be answered in a video, the best way to do that is to go through Quora. So you go to Quora, type up your question. There's a link to my account in the description of this very video and all of my videos on this channel. But if you type up a Tolkien-related question, I'm probably going to pop up as one of the recommended people. Tag me in it, tag some other people in it as well. It's good to get different perspectives on things, and if I like your question a lot, I will feature it in a video. There was something else about that I wanted to say. Now what was that about Quora and all that? Oh, I guess I don't know. All right, well, let's get to a reading. We're going to do a reading. I'm going to lower the music because I feel it's a bit overbearing right there. Okay. So I didn't know what to read from. It was either going to be the Silmarillion or Beren and Lúthien, and I grabbed Beren and Lúthien because it was closer to me, and I realized it's not because the Silmarillion's right here. But I reached over and grabbed. I didn't see the Silmarillion. I see my old paperback, so I'm gonna open and let's find a good part of this to read. Of course, Beren and Lúthien is a chapter in the Silmarillion that tells the story of Beren and Lúthien. But the book form, it has that and has a whole lot of other things, poetic forms of it, different versions of the tale of Beren and Lúthien. And if you find the... sorry, just something happened on Discord that was interesting. If you find a copy of this, I recommend it, because if you like the story of Beren and Lúthien, you get a whole bunch of different versions of it here. It's really cool stuff. What part am I going to read here? I'm going to read a part of a second extract from the Lay of Lúthien. I'll give you maybe the first 60 lines of the prose poem. Here we go. An end there came when fortune turned, and flames of Morgoth's vengeance burned, and all the might which he prepared in secret in his fastness flared, and poured across the thirsty plain, and armies black were in his train. The league of Angband Morgoth broke, his enemies in fire and smoke were scattered, and the Orcs there slew until the blood like dew dripped from each cruel and crooked blade. Then Barahir the bold did aid, with mighty spear, with shield and men, Felagund wounded to the fen. Escaping, they were bound their troth, and Felagund deeply sware an oath of friendship to his kin and seed, of love and succour in times of need. But there of Finrod's children four were Angrod slain and proud Egnor. Felagund and Orodreth then gathered the remnant of their men. Their maidens and their children fair, forsaking war, they made their lair, and cavernous hold far in the south. On Narog's towering bank its mouth was opened, which they hid and veiled, and mighty doors that unassailed, till Turin's day stood vast and grim, they built by trees o'ershadowed dim. And with them dwelt a long time there Curufin and Celegorm the fair, and a mighty folk grew neath their hands in Narog's secret halls and lands. Thus Felagund in Nagrathon still reigned a hidden king whose bond was sworn to Barahir the Bold, and now his son through forests cold wandered alone as in a dream. Esgalduin's dark and shrouded stream he followed till its waters fro, were joined to Syrian hoar, pale silver water wide and free, rolling in splendor to the sea. Now Beren came unto the pools, wide shallow meres where Syrian cools, his gathered tide beneath the stars, ere chafed and sundered by the bars of reedy banks a mighty fen, he feeds and drenches, plunging then into vast chasms underground, where many miles his way is wound. Umboth Mulian, twilight meres, those great wide waters grey as tears, the elves then named, through driving rain, from thence across the guarded plain. The hills of hunters Beren saw, with bare tops bitten bleak and raw, by western winds, but in the mist of streaming rains that flash and hissed. Into the meres he knew there lay, neath those hills the cloven way, of Narog and the watchful halls, of Felagund beside the falls, of Ingwil tumbling from the wold, an everlasting watch they hold. The gnomes of Nagothrond renowned, and every hill is tower crowned, where wardens sleepless peer and gaze, guarding the plain in all the ways, between Narog swift and Syrian pale, and archers whose arrows never fail, with their range the woods, and secret kill all who creep thither against their will. I went a little more. I was going to do 60 lines, and then I realized that wasn't a good spot to stop there. That would have stopped at of streaming rains that flashed and hissed. And that's like the middle of a sentence, because Tolkien, he hits quite the rhythm with this poem, The Lay of Lúthien, and there's multiple versions of the story, there's multiple versions of the poem. If you really like Beren and Lúthien like I do, I highly recommend getting this book. It's really, really wonderful. That was about 74 lines of the second version of The Lay of Lúthien, which is quite long, by the way. That excerpt is, let's see, how long is it? Oh, it's still going. It's right around here where it ends. There we go. It's 557 lines, which is quite long for a poem, but yeah, I mean, T.S. Eliot did epic poems. So, all right, let's get to your questions. I have 17 questions to get through this time, so let's do that. All right, so let's start over here. And let's see this. So this first question came in by request from Jonah Falcon. I know that name, Jonah Falcon. I don't think it's the Jonah Falcon I'm thinking of. There was a Jonah Falcon that I had heard of from like the Howard Stern show. I doubt that's the same guy. I mean, if it is, hey, shout out to you. But anyway, Jonah Falcon asks me, why does Treebeard only speak highly of Gandalf and not Radagast? And I happen to think this is a rather good question because, you know, it comes from when Merry and Pippin are talking to Treebeard, and he's not really sure what to make of them just yet, and they ask him if he knows Gandalf, because they say they are friends of Gandalf, and he says that Gandalf is the only wizard that cares about the trees, and of course he's comparing him to Saruman, who he feels once did care about the trees and no longer does. He's cutting down trees that he shouldn't have and such, and Treebeard is well aware of this. It's not like in the film version where he doesn't know what's going on, and Merry and Pippin sort of have to trick him into seeing the desolation. He's aware of it, and he's already sort of in the process of doing something about it. Merry and Pippin definitely offer assistance to him, and they're invaluable in helping the Ents, but they didn't like sort of trick them into helping. Anyway, you would wonder, why wouldn't he say Radagast? And it's not like Radagast had not already been mentioned already. And I think the only answer here, it's a very easy answer. Treebeard has no idea who Radagast is. You would think he would, but he doesn't. Treebeard is ancient. He's one of the oldest beings in Middle-earth. The only being older than him would probably be Tom Bombadil. He's not that well traveled, though not in the Third Age. He spoke about how he used to walk the land, and he mentions the land below the waves, which is Beleriand, which only existed in the First Age. But by the time the Third Age rolls around, he pretty much sticks to that one forest, the forest that bears his name, Fangorn Forest. Treebeard didn't know where the Shire was. He had never heard of the Old Forest. He didn't know what hobbits were. He thought Gandalf and Saruman were young. He doesn't know their natures. He's wise in his own way, but his knowledge is specialized. He doesn't know everything about everything, and he probably has no idea that there are other wizards out there other than Saruman and Sauron. He certainly wouldn't know Radagast, because if he knew Radagast, I'm sure that he would say that, Radagast also cares about the trees, But that would be why, really. That's the only explanation that makes sense to me. Now, there was somebody in the comments, Marie said that he did know about the Old Forest. He mentioned that in the Old Forest, bad memories are handed down, but in parts of Fangorn, the Great Darkness never lifted. And that's almost correct, but it wasn't true. Merry and Pippin told him about the Old Forest, but what he said was, he talked about the bad memories, and Merry and Pippin said, like the Old Forest, and he said something like that, but much worse. And I think in that case, he was probably talking about Mirkwood Forest, if anything. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. This one came in by request of Stephen Peterson, who asks, did the Valar abandon Middle-earth? I think that's kind of a harsh term. I wouldn't say that they abandoned Middle-earth. That would be the way that Melkor would say it. Melkor would say that they abandoned Middle-earth. The most destructive thing, the most destructive event to ever happen, not just in Middle-earth, but in all of Arda, in the entire planet, was the War of the Valar, which was the very first conflict on the planet. The war was so destructive that it changed the shape of Middle-earth. And the scars, so to speak, from this war are still present even, through to the Fourth Age after the Lord of the Rings. The Valar left after this, taking as many elves with them as were willing to go. They couldn't take the men because the men were not yet awoke. And they would later not want the men in the Undying Lands because it was sort of too sad for them to see them just, they're there and then they're not there, after a period of time that they do not consider to be very long at all. So I wouldn't call this abandoning. They're more withdrawing from Middle-earth. The presence of the Valar means that any major conflict can escalate to them, and any time that they get involved in any kind of conflict, when they use their magic in a warlike way, it's so destructive that it mars the land permanently. With Melkor in chains and the land of Aemon waiting, there was no reason for them to believe that they were needed in Middle-earth anymore, so they sort of withdrew. There was a comment in here from Will Pasto, who said, and I really like this comment, he said, the Valar were the nuclear option, and they knew it, and that's very true. That's exactly what I was getting at. Perhaps Will's just a little bit more straight to the point than I am, but he basically said the same thing. I think he's correct there. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. This one, let's see. In The Lord of the Rings, do elves and dwarves celebrate holidays? The elves definitely celebrate holidays, and the dwarves probably celebrate holidays. Elves have loads of holidays. There's winter celebrations, there's midsummer celebrations, there's the autumn feast, there's and in the story in Unfinished Tales, The Quest for Erebor, it was mentioned that Bilbo celebrated Elvish New Year, so they have a New Year celebration as well. The elves have a lot of holidays to celebrate. Dwarves probably have holidays of their own, and they likely have some sort of celebration. But the thing about dwarvish culture is it's so secret. We know about Durin's Day. It's a lunar holiday in autumn, but it isn't known how the dwarves celebrate it, or if they have a celebration, or if they just sort of quietly observe Durin's Day. So yeah, the thing about it is we know the dwarves have at least one holiday. We don't know what they celebrate. The elves are all about feasting. They feast and they drink and they are merry. The dwarves, we don't know what they do on their holidays or how many holidays they have, just because they're so secretive and they keep their culture really to themselves. All right. Next question. Oh, this is one I get all the time. This is referring to the film, The Lord of the Rings, but it also applies to the book as well, and it's a question that I get a lot, and I think people are sort of not thinking of it properly. I'm going to explain that in a moment, but let me read the question. In the film, why didn't the Nazgûl find Frodo and the ring in Bree? Even if they weren't in the first room they searched, why didn't they look through the rest of the village? They didn't know Aragorn was there, so they had nothing to fear. So there's a bit of an argument in the books. Let me explain that first. That whether or not the Nazgûl actually entered their room and bust up the beds and everything, or whether it was some of the men in Bree that were under the influence of the Nazgûl or under the influence specifically of Saruman. But it actually really doesn't matter either way because the trickery worked perfectly well. Whether it was the Nazgûl that snuck into their room and smashed everything up, or men in their employ or in Saruman's employ, the reaction is the same. They had absolutely no reason to check other rooms or to check in the village. Usually when people ask this question, they say, well, why didn't they just go to the next room? Because that's where they were. They were with Aragorn in the next room. They didn't get the wrong room. They knew it was the right room, and it was a very obvious deception because they put bolsters in the beds with pumpkins to make it seem like there were people sleeping in there. They were tricked, and they knew they were tricked immediately, whether it was the Nazgûl or the men, and they got very angry and they smashed things up, and then they left. Why? Because, think about it for a moment. If you were looking for someone and you sneak into their hotel room, because that's basically what it is, and it looks like they're in the bed, and you sneak up on them, and it was a pumpkin for a head and a bolster for a body. You know that person went out of their way to trick you, that they are aware that you are after them. Are you going to go just over right to the next room? You're going to think they're long gone. They've escaped. They've flown the coop, so to speak. It's really a double deception, making them believe that the hobbits were still there, and then upon seeing that deception, making them believe they must have left. It's fairly logical to assume that if someone goes to the trouble of fooling you with pumpkins and with bolsters, they're long gone. So hiding in the next room almost seems really like a bad idea. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And then it's sort of like Homer Simpson said, "Stupid like a fox." So, it sort of worked out really well. Aragorn knew what he was doing when he came up with that whole plan. And of course, Barliman helped, and Nob as well. So, okay, next question. This one came in from MKR, who asks, after sailing west at the end of the Third Age, did Gandalf retain his limited semi-mortal form in Valinor, at least for a while, or did he immediately resume his old identity as Olorin? If so, what became of his old body? So we don't really know. The answer is going to be I don't know, but I could give you my educated guess. I could give you my best conjecture. I think that, all things considered, the departure of Gandalf, Bilbo, Frodo, Galadriel, Elrond, Gildor, and whoever else happened to be there on that ship was the end of their story. The Lord of the Rings is a tale of Middle-earth, and they are leaving Middle-earth, which is why after they leave, we follow Sam home, not follow Frodo to the Undying Lands. That being said, I'm sure that once Gandalf arrives there, he could shed his mortal body. I don't know what would really become of it. He would probably just burn it off or something. It would probably just be destroyed or fade away in some way. And he could take up his true name and adopt any matter of fauna, because right now he has a real body, what's called a hroa. A fauna is what a spirit wears to be seen by the children of Ilúvatar, so he could adopt a fauna, and he could adopt any fauna he wishes. He could look like Olorin, or he could look like an elf, or he could look like Gandalf if he wanted to. He could make a fauna and choose to be called Gandalf or Mithrandir or any of his other names. So I believe that whether or not he remained incarnated or returned to his spirit and adopted a fauna, I think either way he would have stayed in that Gandalf form, even if he was just adopting it as a fauna for a little while, at least until his mortal friends have passed. Legolas, when he arrives, he's going to get used to the new guy, that he hasn't met, Elorn, because he has all of eternity to get used to Elorn. But Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, Gimli, they're used to Gandalf. That's their friend. So it's familiar, it's comforting. They would probably prefer it over anything else, and they would eventually pass away. And he might choose a different form at that point, a different fauna. But I believe that until that point, until the last of them passed, he would stick with his old man guys. If it was the Hroa or the fauna, either way, I think he would definitely want to appear as Gandalf until that happened. Okay, next question. Did the elves make the Rings of Power? Yeah, they did. They had a little help, though. I'll tell you what happened. The elves made the 19 Rings of Power. The ruling ring, which is also known as the One Ring, was made by Sauron with no help at all. But they didn't exactly just come up with the idea, let's make some Rings of Power. Sauron came to the elves of a country called Lindon, which is actually, we were just talking about the Grey Havens and sailing west, that's where that happens. And he was in disguise. They didn't know it was Sauron. He called himself Anatar, which means gift king or lord of gifts. And he claimed that he was an agent of the Valar, and he was bringing them gifts of great power. And the elves in Lindon didn't trust him. They turned him away. So then Sauron went to Eregion, which was sort of a splinter Noldor settlement that was near Moria, because Celebrimbor left Lindon to settle with some others as well near Moria, because he wanted access to Mithril for his crafts. And he made the same offer, and he was upfront about the fact that Gil-galad and Elrond had turned him down in Lindon, suggesting that maybe they just don't love Middle-earth as much as he does, or perhaps they want to keep all their power and splendor to themselves and not share it with the rest of Middle-earth. So anyway, he was dealing with Celebrimbor, who was Feanor's grandson, so he sort of has crafting in his blood. And he took him up on this offer to learn the craft of making Rings of Power. So the elves of Eregion learned the magic from Anatar, and after some practice attempts, which were resulted in what Gandalf called the Lesser Rings, they made 16 Rings of Power. Anatar, at this point, leaves Eregion, and he goes to Mordor. And after this, Celebrimbor winds up making an additional 3 Rings of Power. When Sauron created the One Ring in Mordor, he poured his power into it, and he became aware of all the ring bearers, and he became aware of these extra 3 rings, which he could sense were more powerful than the rest. However, the elves also sensed him. They realized that they were deceived. They sensed Sauron, so they took the rings off. They wouldn't use them because they heard that one ring to bind them all. Sauron attacks Eregion, and he steals back the 16 Rings of Power, but he doesn't find the 3. They were hidden. They were given to Gil-galad, and Gil-galad in Lindon, he gave one to Círdan, and he sent one off to Galadriel. Sauron later distributed the 16 rings that he had to dwarves and men. So that's sort of like the whole backstory of the Rings of Power there for you. All right, next question. Wouldn't elves and humans biologically be the same species since they are able to reproduce with one another and their offspring are not sterile? Yes, that's absolutely correct. They are biologically the same species, the children of Ilúvatar. Tolkien stated many times that the difference between the firstborn children of Ilúvatar, which is the elves, and the secondborn children of Ilúvatar, which is the men, it's not biological, it's not physiological, it's spiritual. There are physical differences, of course, the most obvious of which is that the elves are always really beautiful, and in a way that's different from the way that men can be beautiful. Like looking at, say, a beautiful woman, a mortal woman, is different than looking at an elf woman. It's not that the elf woman is just that much more beautiful. I mean, it is, but it's also a different sort of beauty. The elves, they don't appear young, they don't appear old, they're sort of almost ethereal in the way they look. They're the most like the Ainur, the angels, but they're not Ainur. They are children of Ilúvatar. So the difference between the two races is chiefly spiritual. The elves are immortal, and they are bound to Arda until its conclusion. well, men die and depart from the world, and they go on a path that very few know, and a destination that only Ilúvatar knows. Elves can be slain, but they will not depart the world. They're stuck. They'll eventually just get new bodies and continue living, or if they're denied that, they will just continue to be there as spirits. But not really spirits in the sense of like angels, but ghosts in a way. Houseless elves, they're called. Elves are stuck until the end of the world, and it was never said what will become of them after that. We know what will become of men, that they will inherit the new world, Arda healed, and that it will be, like wonderful. There's not going to be any more evil. There's not going to be any more taint of Melkor. They're going to do the second music. We don't know what happens to the elves, though. All right, next question. Let's see. This one's from Bryce Harris, who asks, what path did Gandalf want Frodo to take into Mordor, assuming the Cirith Ungol pass was not the preferred route? If he didn't have a path intended, what path would he have wanted Frodo to take to enter Mordor? I don't know. I don't know. Nobody knows, because Gandalf never said anything about this. He never specified as far as that. As we know, Gandalf's plan stopped with reaching Lothlorien, and beyond this, we don't know what he planned. The Fellowship would absolutely have to split. Boromir was not going to go to Mordor, and it's unlikely that Gandalf wanted Aragorn to go to Mordor either. It has been debated for decades whether or not Gandalf had a plan at all beyond reaching Lothlorien, and he just didn't say what the plan was, or maybe he didn't have a plan and he was planning on just getting there and then putting his head together with Celeborn and Galadriel and figuring it out from there. Now, Gandalf didn't make it to Lothlorien, or rather he did make it to Lothlorien, but the Fellowship had already moved on. They thought he was dead and gone. It's possible that Gandalf may have wished to use Cirith Ungol. It's possible that he may have come up with a way of bypassing the Morannon or bypassing Minas Morgul, or he could have known another undiscovered path that we don't know about. This is one of those things that we just can't know. You would have to ask the author, and he died in 1973. And I don't think any Tolkien scholar is going to give you a definitive answer here, because it's just not something we're meant to know. Okay, next question. Is it possible that there are orcs who are distant cousins of Galadriel, Elrond, or Legolas? So this is a doozy. Probably not. It's possible only if we accept the idea that orcs started off as corrupted elves. Tolkien actually did not settle on any definitive origin for the orcs. In the text, it's mentioned that they came about in the First Age, in the time after the awakening of the elves. The original idea was that Melkor captured some elves, tortured them until they became twisted and evil like he was. Later orcs, from after Melkor wasn't around, would not be corrupted elves themselves, but the descendants of corrupted elves. This leads to several problems. Do orcs have souls? Are they immortal? Are they mortal but very long-lived due to being derived from elves? If the original orcs were evil due to Melkor's manipulation and torture, why are their descendants always evil? Do they not have free will? And of course, why did the elves always kill the orcs rather than try to rehabilitate them or heal them in some way? Do they not see them as kin, twisted by evil but worthy of salvation? So, that's a lot of questions, and there's no doubt that Tolkien wrestled with at least some of those questions that I just mentioned. He regretted the whole orc thing. He regretted creating a race in his world that is always evil. There are good elves and there are bad elves. There are good men and there are bad men. There are good dwarves and there are bad dwarves, but orcs are always all bad. In creating the orcs on a literary level, he was creating these nameless, faceless foot soldiers that work for this Dark Lord or that Dark Lord, and then just could be slain in mass without thinking about who they were as people. But in fleshing out his world, we find out they have their own languages, they have their own culture, they have their own individual personalities. It became problematic on several levels. So Tolkien came up with several other theories as to how Melkor created orcs, such as they were not made from elves, but they were made in mockery of elves. This theory has several applications, and as orcs sometimes would criticize Morgoth, or they would criticize Sauron, or they would defy the Dark Lords, this means they had free will. They weren't always beholden to Sauron or to Morgoth. They could not follow him. They were not created the way that dwarves were, because dwarves were created by Aula, who is a Vala, just like Morgoth, and his creations didn't have free will. Only Ilúvatar could create beings with free will, and so he gave free will to the dwarves, but he certainly didn't give free will to the orcs. So here's sort of the issue. That means that whatever the orcs really were, they were pre-existing creatures that Melkor enhanced. If they are capable of rational thought and they were not created by Ilúvatar or gifted rational thought by Ilúvatar like the dwarves, they must have been soulless animals that Melkor enhanced in a mockery of the children of Ilúvatar. In this theory, it covers that they are always evil and they don't have souls, but have been made to resemble creatures that have souls, and they're a product of the taint of Melkor. Now, this isn't a perfect theory, but I find myself wondering on this. Why beings who have free will never choose to be good? Why do they always choose evil? So this theory came from the book Morgoth's Ring, and it never made it into the Silmarillion. It could be that any of the theories of the origins of the orcs that Tolkien put forth are true, or none of them are. But the Silmarillion puts forth the idea that the elves believed that the orcs were derived of their own kin. Now, personally, I believe that whatever the orcs actually are, they are more in mockery of elves and not derived from elves. Tolkien may have never settled on an origin. I gave you one of his theories. He had a bunch of others as well. But he seemed to have straight up changed his mind about them being originally elves. But the Silmarillion isn't the entire story. It's the entire story in the sense that it's the entire narrative of the Legendarium, but it is the story as understood by the elves and as translated by Bilbo. So that being said, I would say that there are probably not any orcs who are distant kin of any elves. Okay, good question. All right, next one. Let's see. Is a Gollum question. If Gollum had led Saruman back to the One Ring as planned, would he be permitted to live and become a slave or a pet to Sauron, or to be tortured and allowed to be nearby the precious but never have it again? So Sauron and Gollum were sort of like oil and water. Gollum would find no mercy, no forgiveness, no reward. While Sauron realized that Gollum, he should be set free. And I'm going to get into that. He realized that he should be set free, and he set him free. And he was ostensibly hoping that he would somehow sniff out the One Ring and lead him to it. The reality is, if Gollum ever found the ring, nobody's ever going to see it again. He's going to put the ring on, he's going to disappear, he's going to go under a mountain somewhere, he's going to wind up where nobody's going to find him, and that's it, right? Nobody ever recovers the One Ring. It's never destroyed. Sauron kind of just wins by default at that point. Gollum is nothing like Sauron. He did not wish to possess power. Now, the One Ring is power. It's most of Sauron's power. Gollum wished to possess the ring, but he had no designs on actually using it. He had no desire to dominate others except to strangle someone for food, and then he used his own strength. Gollum kind of creeps Sauron out. Gandalf stated that the Dark Lord feared something indomitable within Gollum. Gollum is indomitable, meaning he cannot be dominated. He was tortured for information, and he gave Sauron the information that he wanted under torment, but he did not bend to Sauron. He displayed his hostility and his hatred of Sauron openly, something that no one has ever done before when in that sort of situation. So Sauron cut him loose because he really only had two choices here. He could release him and just kind of get him out of his sight and hope that maybe he finds the One Ring, or at least leads him to the One Ring, or he can destroy him. He could not be enslaved. He could not be kept as a pet. While Gollum was content to serve the master of the precious when it was Frodo, he was being duplicitous, and he was leading Frodo to what he hoped would be his demise. He didn't even really truly hate Frodo. Frodo treated him probably better than anyone else ever had, but he was too bound to the ring, too addicted to it, too consumed by it. He couldn't kick that habit. Sauron, though, he hated Sauron with every fiber of his being. Tolkien once said that no one could willingly destroy the One Ring. Frodo did not fail at Samnath Naur because no one else could have done it. No one else could have succeeded in letting go of the One Ring, but he did once entertain a hypothetical situation in which Gollum had become legitimately fond of Frodo. And in this instance, Gollum is still too consumed with the One Ring. He had to attack Frodo. He had to take the One Ring back. But his desire for the ring would be eclipsed by his hatred of Sauron. And in this possible alternate version of the story, Gollum defies the decree that no one could willingly destroy the ring because he would cast the ring and himself into Samnath Naur, and he would do it out of spite. So the real answer is that Sauron would likely just destroy Gollum if he got the ring back, or more likely he would have someone else do it for him so that he didn't have to look at him anymore, because Gollum's defiance and his open hostility really bothered Sauron. Okay, next question. This one came in from Michael, who asks, why didn't the Ents wake up and react while Saruman's forces cut them down? Wouldn't they have noticed and woken up? So I think you're misunderstanding something here, because the Ents are not trees. There was never any indication that Saruman would try to cut down any Ents. They're not trees, they're the shepherds of the trees. From a distance, if you squint, they might look like trees if they're standing very still. Treebeard mentions there are some trees who have become Entish. We call them Huorns. He brings a bunch of them to Helm's Deep, and we're meant to understand the rumors of moving trees in the Old Forest near the Shire were Huorns. He also mentions that there are some Ents who have become sleepy and tree-ish, and they don't move around as much. But he doesn't mention Saruman's forces attacking these slumbering Ents. He just mentions that Saruman has been cutting down trees. Not all the trees in that forest were Ents. The Ents take care of the trees. Okay, next question. What would happen to Gollum if the One Ring was destroyed while he was still alive, freeing him from its influence and allowing Smeagol to re-emerge again without the ring calling to him? Unfortunately, the damage is already done with Gollum. The physical damage, the mental damage, the spiritual damage. It's not something that he would just be released from. The proof is in what happened to Frodo. He didn't get closure. He didn't destroy the One Ring. Nor did he willingly give it up like Bilbo did. Bilbo felt an immense relief as soon as he gave up the ring, but Frodo did not get the chance to do this. Instead, it was ripped from him, creating essentially what you would call psychic damage on him. Gollum also suffered from this, and it was probably worse for him because he was way more attached to the one. He didn't willingly give up the One Ring, but he lost it, and he had it quote-unquote stolen by Bilbo. Frodo suffered from this separation, something that Arwen had anticipated would happen, and she gave him a gem that he could hold on to when things got bad. I'm going to read you a brief passage from The Return of the King. Sam stayed at first with the Cottons, with Frodo, but when the new row was ready, he went with the gaffer. In addition to all other labors, he was busy directing the cleaning up and restoring of Bag End, but he was often away in the Shire on his forestry work. So he was not home in early March and did not know that Frodo had been ill. On the 13th of that month, Farmer Cotton found Frodo lying in his bed. he was clutching a white gem that hung on a chain about his neck, and he seemed half in a dream. "It's gone forever," he said, "and now all is dark and empty." So these episodes, they sort of came and went, but he would never really be freed from it, not by any of the arts in Middle-earth, which is why he had to pass into the West. Gollum probably would have fared a lot worse, because there was a lot more damage there. Now, there were some people in the comments that said that Gollum would just die because the ring would, he would just age because he's like 600 years old and he's a hobbit. They're not supposed to live that long. It's not really how that works. A lot of people get the impression somehow that Bilbo got all the age that he had missed out on as soon as the ring was destroyed, and that's not the case. Bilbo was just very old mentally. Physically, his aging had resumed after he gave up the One Ring, so he would have looked to have been about, we'll say, let's see, he was physically about 50 years old, plus 17 years, after he gave up the ring, and then another year for the quest, and then we'll say another 2 years in the Shire. So he would be about 70 years old physically, which is why he would look different at the Grey Havens than he did, at the beginning of the story. But that's not because the ring was destroyed. It's because he gave up the ring, and because many years have passed since then. Okay, next question. This one came in from Sean MCM, who asks, if Narsil was made by elven smiths rather than a dwarf, would it be harder to break? So, of course, Narsil was Elendil's sword. He was a very big man, and when he died, he fell on the sword, and it broke in half. If it was made by elves, it probably would have been easier to break, not harder to break. There's a reason that men and elves want the dwarves to make their arms and their armor for them. The dwarves are just better at it. It isn't as if men are bad at it or that elves are bad at it either. The Noldor were said to be particularly skilled in these sorts of crafts, but dwarves are on a whole other level entirely. You ask the elves to make things that are beautiful. You ask the dwarves to make something that's going to last and be sturdy. So when it comes to things like swords and armor and such things, the dwarves are making the very best and the hardest to break, I would say. Okay, one moment here. I just have to edit something real quick. Okay, there was a typo there that I wanted to fix. Okay. All right, next question. How tall are Gandalf and Saruman compared to other characters in the Lord of the Rings series? Gandalf is about average man or average elf height. He would be around the same height as, like, for example, Legolas. Gandalf was basically in an average old man body, and he was of normal height, probably similar to Legolas. Legolas might actually appear taller than him because Gandalf was said to stoop over and lean on his staff. Gandalf would be taller than Gimli and, of course, all of the hobbits, but he would be smaller than Boromir and Aragorn because they were exceptionally tall, especially Aragorn. Saruman was probably around the same height as Gandalf, but he might have been taller or maybe just appeared taller just from having better posture. Gimli describes Saruman as looking like and yet unlike Gandalf. Okay, next question. Okay. Oh, this is an interesting one. This one actually requires a bit of visual aid. So let me get that ready to show you. Okay, here we are. So here's the question. What is the reason for Mordor being surrounded by mountains? What is the geographical basis, if any, for Middle-earth's mountain ranges? So there are a lot of places in Middle-earth that are naturally fortified. It does seem, though, a bit eyebrow-raising to see this boxed-in nature of Mordor, protected on three sides from these straight mountain ranges that are almost at right angles with each other. It seems almost too perfect to be natural, right? While Tolkien never gave an explicit explanation for why Mordor is ordered in that fashion, he gave a very implicit one. And the answer is that, as you may have expected, it wasn't natural. The first conflict that ever took place in Middle-earth, we talked about this a little while ago, that was the War of the Valar, or or the Battle of the Powers. This was the war. Melkor is on one side, and on the other side is all of the other Valar. It was mostly not a direct conflict, but a war for Middle-earth, which Melkor claimed as his own, and the firstborn children of Ilúvatar, the Elves. It was a war of creation and destruction, with Melkor damaging the land and changing it to suit his own desires, while the Valar were combating this and trying to put it right. Eventually, it came down to a direct confrontation. Melkor quailed before Tulkas and Oroma. He was wrestled down to the ground, chained, and brought to Aemon. The results of Melkor terraforming Middle-earth can be seen in these mountain ranges. Most of all, he created fortresses out of mountains, some of which he put to use and others he did not. While Mordor was not mentioned by name, it was said that in the book The Peoples of Middle-earth, that Mount Doom was created by Melkor at this time. So it stands to reason that he created Mordor and its mountains as well. The land of Hithlum, which was in Beleriand, or was, I should say, north of Beleriand, looks almost identical to Mordor on a map, just lopsided with the same configurations of mountains. And I brought up a comparison here. Here's Mordor, and here's Hithlum. I had to turn it over, but you could see it's a very similar shape, a very similar configuration of three sides being completely ensconced in mountain, with this little extra bit here, and this is sort of extra bit here. This one, it's sort of angled in a different way, but you can see what I'm talking about here. You can see that it's very, very similar. So if you turn Hithlum around, the shape of the mountains is almost identical to Mordor. There's also Dorthonion and Thangorodrim, which are even more enclosed in the mountains. Not in that same exact boxy way, but similar. Melkor may have never made use of Mordor specifically, but he was trying to remake all of Middle-earth to be the way that he wanted it to be. Not all of his mountain fortresses got used by him or used by Sauron. The Chrysaegrim, for example, wound up being discovered by the Elves and became the location of Gondolin. So some of them wound up being used for good. Okay, next question. What would happen if Eru Ilúvatar, the creator of Middle-earth, came back to the world? So I have to correct a little thing there. Ilúvatar can't come back to the world because he hasn't been to it yet in Tolkien's books. Ilúvatar made the world, but he didn't enter it. Only the Ainur did. He did place a small portion of himself, the secret fire, at the heart of Ea, that's the universe, and he was able to communicate with the Valar, which mostly Manwë, although he did speak directly to Aule at one point, when Aule created the dwarves, but without actually being there, without actually visiting the world. As to what happens when he finally decides to visit, well, Tolkien would tell you, if you asked him about this, probably in a very humorous way, that there was a book written about this, but not by him. Tolkien was writing literature, but he also framed it as English mythology, and he wished for Ilúvatar to be seen as indistinct from the God of Abraham, so he would just say, read the Bible. That's what he would say. Okay, last question. Let's see. Who is Aragorn a descendant of? I've seen people state he was really an heir of Anárion, but he is said to be the heir of Isildur. What's the truth? So the truth is he's both. He is descended from Isildur, and he is descended from Anárion, which is why his claim to being the king of Gondor and Arnor is so much stronger. Aragorn was not the first guy to try this. He wasn't the first to try to reunite the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. His ancestor, Arvedui, tried it, and he was rejected by the Council of Gondor on advice from the ruling steward of the time, because he was not descended from Anárion. He was only descended from Isildur. Now, does that really matter? That's sort of a matter of opinion. Some would say that Isildur was a king of Gondor along with Anárion, and others would state that he was a king of Arnor only. This was likely a case of the ruling stewards not wanting to give up their power, and in doing so, they decided that only an heir of Anárion could satisfy their conditions. Now, it wasn't just as cut and dry in that there was a lot of back and forth between Arvedui and the steward and the Gondorian council. When Arvedui, he wasn't an heir of Anárion, but his wife was. His wife Firiel was descended from Anárion. Gondor did not accept ruling queens, only queen consorts. And to explain that, it means that the queen of Gondor was the king's wife. But she couldn't rule alone. So if the king dies, the queen doesn't take over. The kingship goes to the next surviving male heir, and the queen consort would become what they would likely would call the queen dowager, and the new queen consort would be the new king's wife. So Arvedui said, well, this isn't really in the tradition of Númenor. Númenor at first was like that. They had this fully male or agnatic lineage, but then there was Tar Aldarion, and he changed the laws of Númenor, which was approved by the Council of Númenor, to allow women to rule. And this was because he wanted his daughter, Ancalame, to rule after him instead of one of his male cousins, or a nephew. So Gondor had no reply to this. Arvedui had a point. He was right. But the stewards also had a point as well, because Gondor may have been derived from Númenor, but it wasn't Númenor. They were their own nation, and they can have their own laws, and they can do things the way that they want to do things. But he also had another good point, that Elendil never meant for his realm to be split like that, for there to be two different nations. He wanted there to be a king of Gondor and a king of Arnor and a high king above them all in the United Kingdom, which is funny because that's where Tolkien's from. Either way, due to Arvedui being Isildur's heir and Firiel being Anárion's heir, that means that all of their heirs would be descended from both Anárion and Isildur, and that would lead, of course, to Aragorn. Now, Denethor II, he was ready to reject Aragorn's claim anyway, despite the fact that he was descended from both, despite the fact that he had been fulfilling all sorts of prophecies that were specific to the return of the king. And it was because he wasn't descended from Anárion through an unbroken male line, and no one was. That line was broken. It's impossible to produce someone that was. This is another example of the steward not wishing to give up power. Of course, Denethor II wound up taking himself out of the equation completely, and the next steward, which was Faramir, willingly conceded power by recognizing Aragorn as the king, and he was even willing to give up the office of steward if necessary, though Aragorn wanted to continue having stewards and have Faramir as his steward. Okay, well, if you guys got this far in the video, you enjoyed it, right? So give me a like, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, leave me some comments, recommend the channel to some of your friends, anybody that might be interested, and share it around maybe a little bit. I'll see you guys next week.